Germans are an old people. Their language is centuries older than English, French, Spanish, or Italian, but the history of a dozen years has cast a long shadow over the thousands of years of their existence as a people. The rule of Hitler and the Nazis from 1933 to 1945 not only sealed the fate of the Germans of that generation, as colored the way Germans have been seen since, as well as the way the previous history of Germans has been seen. German intellectual figures, social traditions, and political movements in centuries past that were once seen in the context of their own times are now often seen as precursors of Nazi totalitarianism or of the Holocaust. Was all of German history leading up to Hitler? Or were the Nazi years simply a tragic aberration on a monumental scale? The collectivization of Germans in the minds of others has had major consequences in the real world, quite aside from its impact on intellectual conceptions of this people. At the end of the Second World War, millions of people of German ancestry living outside the Reich in various parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans were sent back to Germany. Even though many of these families had been living where they were for centuries, and many of the individuals sent back to Germany had in fact never seen Germany. Winston Churchill protested these mass expulsions of millions of Germans on a scale grievous and undreamed of, and said, "We must banish revenge against an entire race from our minds." In order to assess the 12 fateful years of the Nazi regime and its relationship to German culture and history in general, we must first review that history and that culture. Germans as a people have extended well beyond the boundaries of present-day Germany, not only in Europe but in overseas settlements in the Western Hemisphere and as far away as Australia. The extent to which these far-flung settlements could be considered German, and for how long, depends of course on the extent to which German culture persisted among them, and whether or not that culture was linked to the German nation-state. To assess that, we need to see, at least in outline, some of the prominent features of the culture and values historically associated with Germans. Moreover, the features of German culture stand out in sharper relief against the cultures of the surrounding peoples, such as Slavs of Eastern Europe or the British and French to the west. Germans before Germany. Germans were recognized as a distinct people as far back as Roman times, many centuries before there was a nation-state of Germany. Like all other peoples, Germans evolved socially, culturally, and politically within the influence and constraints of geography and the imperatives of other peoples. The great cultural impact of the Roman Empire, which left enduring marks on the development of Western Europe, reached what is now France long before it reached what is now Germany, simply because the mountains that impeded movement into Central Europe and Eastern Europe were more formidable than the geographic obstacles to expansion into Western Europe. The great East-West divide that has split Europe culturally and economically for thousands of years since then goes back to the intractable facts of geography as the arena within which human achievements developed and spread, or failed to develop and failed to spread. Eastern Europe has differed from Western Europe not only in that the West was part of the Roman Empire for centuries and the East was not, but also that the many geographic advantages of Western Europe were lacking in much of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. Mineral deposits such as iron ore and coal, crucial to the Industrial Revolution, have been more abundant in Western Europe. The milder climate of Western Europe, warmed by the Gulf Stream, has meant that its rivers have remained flowing, when those of Eastern Europe are frozen for months at a time. Moreover, the navigable waterways of Western Europe empty into the open seas, providing access to the trade routes of the world, while many of the rivers of Eastern Europe even when flowing into lakes or inland seas. Being part of the Roman Empire meant that Western Europe had not only a common language, Latin, but a literal language, centuries before there were written versions of the various Slavic languages of Eastern Europe. Written words have been essential to science, scholarship, and literature, as well as facilitating economic development, all of which flourished in Western Europe for centuries before they had a comparable impact in Eastern Europe. This meant that there was an accumulation of centuries of literature in philosophy, science, history, and other fields in the languages of Western Europe and of Germany before any such literature began to be developed in Eastern Europe. One result of this was that for centuries, whatever educated class existed in Eastern Europe read and wrote primarily in languages other than their own vernaculars, which had no comparable serious literature. The association of class with language was so strong that even when Czech nationalism developed within the Habsburg Empire, those nationalists published their patriotic and anti-German tracts in German. When they wrote in Czech in the 18th century, they wrote such things as children's stories or light romantic novels, or they wrote translations from German or other languages. When the Ukrainian or Belarusian languages began to be used in plays, they were used in dialogue for comic characters. The rise of an indigenous intelligentsia was marked by their resentment of such cultural subordination, a resentment and a promotion of group identity that they spread to other members of their respective groups. This was as true among the Russians as among the Czechs or Latvians. Magnificent section on the Germans in history, and black rednecks, white liberals. I was watching Colin Flaherty. I had an extra H in there, Colin Flaherty, and there was some old black dude from New Orleans. When you're young, this happened to me in San Francisco all the time, and I had a homeboy who we used to make jokes about this. We're both mixed. And your very polite white parent would just sit there smiling nervously as oddball old black people felt like breaking down some knowledge to their mixed child. And all kinds of black male nut jobs used to say all kinds of nutty things. And it only was until recently that I just didn't know why there were so many black people who were into like ancient aliens and stuff like that. I'm like, why, where'd they get this? Like, where the hell do hippies and black people get this from? And now I know. It's like, oh, okay, it came from the spiritual underground of the 1800s, and it's spread widely among black scholars. This Prislam, was it Dr. Jacob, lines in the Bible that show that the black people who were the Israelites, and they were taken by the Egyptians on boats to some place, or that black Hebrew Israelite fucking crap. That one turns out that's actually literally a thing called white Israelitism. Like they literally took the very papers of white Israelitism of Britain and wrote black everywhere. It said white people or Caucasians. I'm not kidding. They actually, yeah, they really did that. They completely plagiarized the system of a white supremacist religion. We call it, I think, if I got it right, it's called Christian Identity, Church of Jesus Christ Christian. I don't even think it exists anymore. It came into existence legally the exact same year as the Nation of Islam. That one I know for sure. I looked that one up. As legal entities, both the Christian Identity Church and the Nation of Islam happened the same fucking year. I'm never bought that the Nation of Islam is some absolutely organic thing. Never bought it then. I'm never going to buy that. I'm never going to buy it. I think that there's something that I think they're as dirty as the day is long. But I don't trust organized. I have a hard time trusting organizations because of that wicked streak of mine. But I thought I'd read a little about Germany, because this old man talking about how, if it wasn't for, the black people and the whites being able to rip all the blacks in Africa off and steal all the gold and all the stuff, all the, the diamonds and the gold, and, and these are people, they just don't know up from down. When you look at it, it's shipping is shipping. Shipping something from Scotland to Britain is a shit ton cheaper than Africa. Shipping stuff from Des Moines to Illinois is a whole lot cheaper than shipping something from fucking Africa, a country that still has megalithic predators. They have had weapons, firearms, for hundreds of years. Black people have been able to use firearms for hundreds of years. They still have megalithic predators, such that there's stuff they can't do because of the megalithic animals. I just love when black people do this, when they are still trying to do this thing, like, you need our superpowers, and if it wasn't for the magic kryptonite you have in your tricknology, we would be flying on carpets, ruling you, and it's just so obvious. One of the things that's real sad about it is, I remember my homeboy and I, the issue really comes down to is, you're sitting there and you're looking at each other and you're like, they really think this. They're like that. That's how mature up there as a people their mind are. Like, white people aren't thinking about ruling the blacks by the whip. It just doesn't come into their mind. They're like, I need to get to work, make money, and then I'm going to go home and do these things I enjoy with people I like. Black people are thinking about magic carpets, HOTEP, the white hose they're going to rule, one day when the revolution comes. I mean, it's bonkers fucking stuff that they're concerned with. Obviously, and this is obviously of intense concern to black people. Otherwise, they would write books on engineering. They would be famous for this. This is what I want. I read a lot of stuff with names like Chang as the author, because I read scientific studies. I look through articles about racial grievance. There's no Wongs, there's no Changs. There's every once in a while maybe an Ng, a Nguyen. The Hongs just aren't terribly concerned about African gold. The Chinese complain that if there weren't black people in Africa, they would actually be able to get the resources. At least they would be able to ship a bunch of Chinese people there. There's a real complaint. This is like, I'm not making this up. This is not cruelty. This is well known. The colonial period benefited. It was a loss to Europe. Britain needed to get rid of its colonies starting in like the 1850s. It needed to start shedding them and and cashing out. That's when it would have been cashing out. It was considered that would be unchristian to simply just pull up stakes like you were a raider. Their comparison was to Islam, the way that Muslims actually treated Africans. That's what the comparison was made to. And they didn't want to use Africans like they were, like a bunch of Saracens would. This is the thing I just love about confused, addle-minded people who, especially the ones who they've read enough Marx that they think that Marx actually was some kind of economist. So they're like, oh yeah, the exploitation of Africa. And it's like, actually, Europe traded almost entirely with itself to this day. Like, to this day, Europe mostly does internal trade. Only because of petroleum is there really a need for, and now light manufacture outside of the continent. The first world does need the third world. But the third world needed the first world up until pretty much the 90s. I mean, China needed us. We didn't need China. Now it's just we fucked up because the Democrats wanted to give away all the jobs, that light manufacturing jobs that poor white people and black people had. Democrats did that. The neoliberals, but I mean, they went along, Democrats went along with it. They didn't care. They don't have something in them that makes them care about a group of people called the blacks. That's not a thing. People don't care about a group of people. Nobody in New Orleans is worried about Belize. And now, if that didn't even make sense about what I just said, that's how little you understand anything about the black diaspora. Where's all those NOLA people, like, putting their support NOLA for Venezuela? Because of that musical tie that the two countries have. I mean, about that, black people. Like long hair, and people like Alan Toussaint, and the way that they play piano in Venezuela. Or maybe you don't, because you might not know shit.